Hello and welcome to the session on pharmacotherapy of tuberculosis. As for any infection, we will first discuss what is tuberculosis, what problems does it pose, and how the treatment regimens have been devised. We'll also see the currently prevalent patient categories and treatment regimens because fight against tuberculosis continues. We had apparently countered it, but then it is resurging again, taking us back to pre-anti-TB medication era. So what are the prevalent patient categories and the treatment regimens in force today? And then we will see the details of the drugs which are being used in these treatment regimens. So obviously we'll have to split it into parts. In part one, we'll be trying to understand the tuberculosis and the treatment strategies devised. Part two will cover the actual treatment regimens in the prevalent patient categories. And part 3 and 4 will elaborate on the individual drugs. So let's start with part 1, understanding tuberculosis and the treatment strategies. So what is tuberculosis? It is a chronic granulomatous disease which explains what's happening inside the body. The causative organism is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is having mycolic acid in the cell wall. These are acid-fast aerobic bacilli, which means they are happier or they thrive in oxygen-rich environment. And therefore, you will understand that the commonest form of tuberculosis is pulmonary tuberculosis because we obtain this infection through droplets exhaled by patients of tuberculosis. So the entry is through inhalation and they find the friendly environment, oxygen-rich environment at the very first point where they enter a human body. And therefore, pulmonary tuberculosis is the commonest site where tuberculosis is encountered. Of course, it can migrate to other sites, which are referred to as extrapulmonary tuberculosis. And the commonest extrapulmonary site, other than lungs, is GI tract. As you know, productive cough is one of the symptoms of tuberculosis and fever. And this productive cough, the sputum, which carries the bacteria, if it is swallowed, they can lead to GI infection. And through the highly vascular lungs, of course, it can migrate anywhere. So you can also get TB meningitis, TB spine, and so on. So, but the commonest one is obviously the pulmonary tuberculosis. And as we already discussed, the transmission of infection from one patient to other individuals is through droplet infection. And the tubercle bacilli exhaled either through cough or sneeze of a TB patient can remain viable in air for hours together. Therefore, it is not a must that a TB patient sneezes or coughs in front of you in order to catch that infection. You may just pass through the air where this event has happened. The TB patient has sneezed or coughed without taking due precautions, and the bacteria would still be there in the air, and you may inhale them and catch the infection. Whether you develop the actual disease or not, that's another question. We'll discuss it later. So transmission is obtained from droplet infection from another tuberculosis patient. So again, cough hygiene, which has become prominent today with corona, is important to prevent transmission of tuberculosis as well. Other understanding that we need to have about the infection is the morphology and the functioning of the microbe, which helps us to identify targets for drug action. For example, these mycobacteria have lipid-rich cell wall with multiple layers, and the outermost layer is very much rich in mycolic acid. And therefore, many anti-TB drugs target synthesis of mycolic acid to damage the bacteria. Similarly, there are polypeptides interspersed. Below the mycolic acid layer is the arabinoglycan galactan layer, which again is a target for some drugs. Then we have peptidoglycan layer, innermost component of the cell wall, and below which is the cell membrane. Plus, of course, the cellular organelles also offer targets for drug action. So if we have so many targets, what were the hurdles? Initially, tuberculosis was used in Bollywood as a reason to eliminate a hero in his young age, that to just show him cough out and blood on his handkerchief to know that this person was going to exit from the story. And this remained the situation for quite some time. And why? Tubercle bacilli grow very slowly, unlike most other microbes, and they divide once in just 1 or 2 days. This is a problem because most of our drugs, or we have many drugs which can target and attack rapidly replicating bacteria. There are very few drugs which can tackle the slowly multiplying or dormant bacilli. Similarly, this poses a problem for culture sensitivity testing because the conventional ways of culture sensitivity testing would require weeks or even 2 months to get the proper results, to grow these bacteria and see the effect of drugs. So that was another hurdle. Culture sensitivity reports took a lot of time, though now with advanced technology, we have rapid tests to diagnose TB as well as to diagnose the responsiveness to the key drugs which we are using. As we said, the bacteria replicate very slowly and some of them even remain dormant for quite some time inside the caseous cavities which are formed. White blood cells and macrophages are our first line of defense, and these bacteria can remain viable and replicate even inside the macrophages. So macrophages which engulf them to kill these bacteria, are not able to kill them. So they remain viable inside the macrophages. So more than one drugs may coalesce. So we get multinucleated giant cells, and the bacteria may still thrive inside these giant cells. This posed a problem because the very first drug which was introduced in management of tuberculosis was streptomycin. And streptomycin, an aminoglycoside, a lipid insoluble drug, could not enter these macrophages. And therefore, these macrophages and giant cells ended up protecting the bacteria from our only drug, streptomycin. And so the duration of treatment was 2 years. Streptomycin had to be there waiting when the bacteria replicated inside these cells and emerged, rupturing the cell. Then streptomycin could attack them and kill them. So these are basically intracellular pathogens. Caseation and fibrosis, which are the events which happen as the disease progresses, they reduce the blood supply to the infected area. And if blood supply is reduced, access of drugs to the site is also reduced. The intracellular pathogens require cell-mediated immunity as the host defense mechanism. And this takes some weeks to get into gear. And if inherently it is low, so as I said, even if you're exposed to tubercle bacilli, whether you develop the frank disease or not depends on your immunity. If the host immunity is low, then the disease will manifest itself and also spread. So host immunity is an important factor. Another important thing to remember is that some of these bacteria may be inherently resistant to one or more drugs used in tuberculosis. And this is expressed as 1 in 10 raised to 6 or 10 raised to minus 6 pathogen may be resistant to, say, drug INH, which is one of the key drugs. That means 1 in 10 lakh microbes could be inherently resistant to INH, which means that there is already acquired resistance. It is not because of inadequate or inappropriate exposure to INH. So this inherent resistance ranges from 1 in 10 raised to 6, 1 in 10 lakh to 1 in 10 raised to 8 microbes for various drugs. And if used alone, this resistant microbe may flourish and we get rapid emergence of resistance. So this was another hurdle in management of tuberculosis. And finally, as was already discussed, sensitivity testing took a long time. Now we have rapid testing facilities with the advancement of technology to diagnose tuberculosis as well as to diagnose the sensitivity pattern of the tubercle bacilli. So to take into account and to overcome all these hurdles, the strategy used today uses multiple drugs in the treatment. So why multiple drug treatment? To tackle these inherently resistant bacilli. For example, 1 in 10 lakh microbes could be resistant to INH. 1 in 100 lakh would be resistant to rifampicin inherently. So if you use only INH, the sensitive ones get killed, and this minority, this rare resistant bacilli, bacterium will replicate and the entire population will be resistant. But if we use multiple drugs, it is very less likely that the same bacterium is resistant to INH as well as rifampicin. So if you use multiple drugs, we can manage to eliminate even these inherently resistant bacteria by the use of the other drugs. So we are able to prevent emergence of resistance by using this multiple drug treatment. They also help to control emergence of resistance to each other. Using these multiple drugs helps us to achieve early maximal possible cell kill, which gives us early sputum negativity and early control of transmission, and of course, early symptomatic treatment. Killing of persisters would avoid relapse, and overall shorter duration of action would result in better patient compliance. And if the entire regimen is taken religiously by the patients, it will avoid emergence of resistance, achieve total cure, and of course, because of shorter duration, shorter exposure to all these multitude of drugs, it also helps us to reduce the possibility of toxicity of these drugs. And therefore, today, tuberculosis is handled by using multiple drug regimens. Which 4 drugs to be used? We cannot just put together any 4 drugs just because we want multiple drug regimen. So the choice of drugs depends on study of the subpopulations of tubercle bacilli in our body, their requirements, the environment in which they flourish. So the subpopulations of tubercle bacilli in an infective region could be classified as the rapidly growing bacilli in the walls of the lesions where the pH is neutral and oxygen supply is high. These 2 parameters become important because they also decide the choice of drugs. So we have rapidly growing bacilli in the walls of the lesions where the pH is neutral and oxygen supply is high. We have slow growing bacteria inside the macrophages, and importantly, inside the new sites where inflammation is ongoing. And in both these sites, inside the cells, as well as particularly so in the inflamed areas, the pH is acidic. We have persisters within the caseous lesions, slow replicating bacteria within the caseous lesions, and at this site, the pH is neutral, but oxygen supply is minimized because of obstructed blood supply to these lesions. And of course, there are some completely dormant, just not doing any activity at all. And these are the most difficult to handle. Another important consideration while choosing these 4 drugs is there should be no cross resistance. And this is a rule for choosing multiple drugs for any infection. Because if there is cross resistance between these primary drugs which are being used, if one is lost, all 4 would be lost. So this is another important criteria. There should be no cross resistance between the 4 drugs chosen as first line treatments. So which are these 5 first line drugs, out of which 4 are commonly used. We'll see why. So INH, rifampicin, ethambutol, and streptomycin are the 4 drugs amongst these 5 which are effective against the rapidly growing bacteria in the wall of the caseous lesions. So H stands for INH, R for rifampicin, E for ethambutol, and S for streptomycin. For bacteria growing inside the macrophages or in the inflamed areas with acidic environment, streptomycin we discussed does not enter the cells. So the drugs are INH, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol. Streptomycin cannot enter inside the macrophages. For persisters within the caseous lesions, it is one and only rifampicin. For dormant bacteria, there could be some new drugs which are not yet into the regimens. So amongst all these drugs effective in the rapidly growing bacteria in the walls, INH is the most effective. For the acidic pH, particularly in the newly affected inflamed sites, pyrazinamide is the most important drug. And for persisters, it is rifampicin. As I said, bedaquiline or protamidate could be useful in dormant bacteria, but they're not yet regularly incorporated in the regimens. All these multi-drug regimens have 2 phases. Initial intensive phase with more number of drugs for a shorter duration are utilized to get early cell kill, early symptomatic relief, early sputum negativity to block transmission. And the continuation phase with fewer number of drugs, but for longer duration, is to mop up the persisters to get complete eradication and thereby prevent relapse. So any regimen you consider for any category of patient would have initial intensive phase and a continuation phase. And the regimens that we would be discussing are those regulated by WHO in 2010 and incorporated by RNTCP, the revised National Tuberculosis Control Program in India from 2016. And these are the regimens in place today. According to these guidelines, the anti-tubercular drugs can be classified as first-line drugs, which we just discussed: INH, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, ethambutol, and streptomycin are the first-line drugs. And now, because of emergence of resistance, second-line drugs have also been defined as components of the treatment regimen for resistant tuberculosis, in which we have Group 2, which includes injectable drugs. Group 3 includes fluoroquinolones. Group 5 is other oral drugs, which also have become necessary to be used in these treatment regimens. Obviously, the first line drugs, the first 5 drugs were chosen because they are more effective and less toxic, and these subsequent groups which are included are either less effective and or more toxic than the first line agents. And this is an important consideration in the patient counseling, which goes into place before starting any patient of tuberculosis on treatment. A lot of counseling is done to convince the patient of the importance of religious adherence to the treatment guidelines, because it is good for the patient and for the community if there is no default and no chance for emergence of resistance. So we can use this attribute of these second line drugs. They're less effective, an injectable drug has to come into picture, they're more toxic, and therefore the patient is advised to religiously adhere to the first line drugs which are advocated when he's newly diagnosed and the treatment is started. Because of emergence of resistance even to some of these second line drugs, a group 5 has been kept ready, which are the possible drugs which have been identified to be used if required, though they have not yet been tested in tuberculosis, so their effectiveness is not yet assured. So we have a third line, plan 3, ready in case all these second line drugs are also getting surrendered to tuberculosis. And it is very soon happening because we do have extensively drug resistant tuberculosis. So this is a warning in general for appropriate judicious use of any antimicrobial agents. Tuberculosis is an example where we are soon going back to an era where we may not have any treatment for tuberculosis. In this new classification of drugs, obviously streptomycin, which is one of the first line drugs, may get classified as an injectable drug, class 2. As UG students, undergraduate students, you must know everything about the first line drugs. And amongst the second line drugs, these 5 drugs which have already got a place in RNTCP guidelines for resistant tuberculosis need to be remembered. So kanamycin from the injectable drugs, levofloxacin is the first fluoroquinolone which is being used, ethionamide, cycloserine, and para-amino salicylic acid must be known as they are components of the regulated regimens used under RNTCP. The first line drugs must be known in details, and it will be helpful if you remember them in this sequence with their abbreviations because the treatment regimens use these short forms. So H for INH, isoniazid, R for rifampicin, Z for pyrazinamide, E for ethambutol, and S for streptomycin. It's also important or useful to you to remember them in the sequence to remember their doses. Because for tuberculosis, we do expect undergraduate medical students or even physiotherapy students to remember the doses of these anti-TB drugs. So it's easier to remember the milligrams per kilogram doses in this sequence. So INH is 5, rifampicin 10 milligrams per kilogram, pyrazinamide 25, ethambutol 15, and streptomycin 15. So 5, 10, 25, 15, and 15 milligrams per kilogram. But for streptomycin, we must remember that even if the patient is requiring more according to this per kg dose, if the patient is more than 50 years, the maximal dose which can be given is 0.75 grams. That is 750 milligrams per day, which is the dose for 50 kg person. But even if he's weighing more, if he is 50 years and above, we do not go beyond 750 milligrams per day. Because it is important to ensure that all these 4 drugs or 3 drugs, according to the phase of the treatment, should be administered to the patient, and to make it easy for administration, we now have fixed dose combination tablets of all these drugs. So in the initial intensive phase for newly diagnosed patient, we need 4 drugs: INH, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol, as we'll be studying later. So we have fixed dose combination tablets for all these 4, where each tablet would contain 75 milligrams of INH, 150 milligrams of rifampicin, 400 milligrams of pyrazinamide, and 275 milligrams of ethambutol. So such 4-member or 4-drug FDC would be required for intensive phase. In the continuation phase for a newly diagnosed patient today, we need to give only H, R, and E. So we do have fixed dose tablets for just H, R, and E, but the composition of these tablets, the amount of each drug would be same as has been elaborated in the table. And the dose for each patient could be easily deduced in terms of tablets per day. For example, in intensive phase, a patient weighing less than 40 kilograms, about 20 but less than 40, takes 2 tablets of HRZE combination during intensive phase and 2 tablets of HRE combination in the continuation phase, and so on. To make it easy for you to remember, you can understand that the weight slabs are 15 kilogram slabs. So if you remember that it starts at 25 kilogram, Up to less than 40, it's 2 tablets of the appropriate combination in the intensive and continuation phase. Up to 55 kilograms of weight, it is 3 tablets. Less than 70 kilograms, it is 4 tablets. And above 70 and above, it is 5 tablets of HRZE in the intensive phase per day and 5 tablets of HRE in the continuation phase per day. So in this part 1, we have tried to understand what is tuberculosis, what are the problems in management, what are the targets for drug intervention and the drug strategies, why multiple drugs, which multiple drugs and why they've been chosen, and how these drugs are to be administered, and the ease of administration afforded by the fixed dose combination tablets. So revise and remember. Happy learning. Thank you.